So what was the basic mistake made by the European Union? Very simple mistake. When you live next to a great power, and Russia is a great power, you must understand that every great power has got security concerns, right? They want to protect themselves. And the way they protect themselves is by ensuring that no hostile force is planted near their borders. And by the way, if you want the best historical example of this, you just have to look at what happened during the time of President John F. Kennedy, when the then Soviet Union wanted to plant missiles in Cuba next to the United States of America. The United States of America said, no way, you cannot plant missiles close to my borders. If you do, I'll start a war. And incidentally, you should all study the Cuban episode of 1962, 1963, because that's when the world came closest to having a nuclear war, right? And, as you know, in a nuclear war, and a nuclear war can result, if you have bad geopolitics, you will see that as a result of a bad geopolitics, you can have a nuclear war happen to you also. And that, by the way, means the end of the world, the end of humanity. And this is why you have to pay attention to geopolitics. As I said, in business, you go bankrupt, you carry on. In geopolitics, you have wars, you lose lives. In the worst case scenario, nuclear war, everybody dies. That's why geopolitics is important. And I gave you an example of how that almost happened in 1960. Now, we used to think, in those days, that people were not so clever. This is 2025. They are much more clever. And guess what? We also brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war in the 2020s. And this happened because the European states didn't try to understand the security concerns of Russia and continued to expand NATO. And NATO is a hostile force to Russia. They continued to expand NATO eastwards towards Russia. And what was terrible about this is that the West kept on doing this, even though the West had promised Russia that it would not expand NATO, right? And what is amazing about the Ukraine war is that 25 or 26 years ago, in the year 1999, 26 years ago, a great American thinker called George Kennan. And George Kennan was the man who masterminded the Cold War strategy for United States. He was a brilliant strategic thinker. And he said 26 years ago, he says, why are we expanding NATO? Why are we pushing NATO closer to the Russia? He says, if you do that, you'll get the Russians very angry. And when the Russians get angry, they will react against you, right? They will launch a military invasion, and then you'll blame the Russians, right? And the West is blaming the Russians, right? But 26 years ago, they were warned, right? Explicitly warned. You should not expand NATO. So, and by the way, if you want more facts on this, there are two professors, two American professors who have spoken a lot about the subject. One is Professor John Mearsheimer from the Chicago University. You can Google his lecture on the origins of the Ukraine war has been watched 40 million times. 40 million times. So it's a very persuasive lecture. And then you can also listen to another American professor, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. And these two professors give you all the information on how the Ukraine war could have been avoided if the West had been wiser, right? Now, what is shocking is that the most advanced societies have made this mistake. And what is really terrible about this mistake that has been made by the Europeans, I mean, I got to emphasize that the push to expand NATO came, of course, primarily from the United States, and the United States was trying to expand its sphere of influence, which is what great powers do. But the Europeans could have been wiser, and the Europeans could have told the Americans, this is not wise. You should not corner Russia. You should not put Russia in a position that it will lead to a war in Ukraine, right? The Europeans could have prevented it. So why didn't the Europeans do so? And I can tell you that one reason for this is that the Europeans have become incompetent. And don't take my word for it. You know, another great strategic thinker of the 20th century who just passed away recently was the great American strategic thinker, Henry Kissinger. I had the pleasure of getting to know him. I think Ibu Bella mentioned that I was in New York. So when I was serving as Singapore's ambassador to New York, I got to know Henry Kissinger. And I went to see him for my last one-on-one conversation in October 2022, about a year before he died. He died in October 2023 at the age of 100. And I remember in my conversation with him, I asked him about the Ukraine war, and he made it very clear that one reason why the Ukraine war happened was because the quality of mind of European leaders has been going down. They were not thinking long-term and strategically about the world. And they could have easily anticipated the Russian reaction, but they didn't anticipate it. And as a result of it, you had this cruel war happening in Ukraine, right? So that's why I want to emphasize to you, the first point I want to emphasize to you is that geopolitics is a very cruel game, and therefore you have to understand it well, because if you don't understand it well, your country can get caught in wars. And you are absolutely right that the West is still in many ways ideologically dominant in ideas. In fact, a lot of the time we listen to Western media. But at the same time, it's also true that respect for the West is going down around the world. And if there's one word that has caused the respect for the West to go down dramatically in the last 18 months or so, it is the word called Gaza. Now, every day when we turn on the TV, we can see that the people of Gaza are suffering, right? Now, we all, of course, condemn the attacks by Hamas on Israel. We condemn them because they're terrorist acts. But at the same time, the innocent people living in Gaza also need to be protected. And what is interesting is that all the Western leaders, they are very quick to talk about human rights abuses in Xinjiang, China, right? Tony Blinken said that there's genocide in Xinjiang, but there's no genocide in Xinjiang. Millions of people are not dying. There's no genocide, right? But when it comes to the killings in Gaza, even though everyone says that there have been violations of international law, international humanitarian law in Gaza, no Western leader is stepping up for that. And so the West has lost its moral credibility on the world stage. It is no longer as dominant as it used to be in the past. And as long as every day that Gaza continues, the West will lose its moral standing. One thing I must tell you all, that the West likes to portray itself as a benign and benevolent civilization, right? Western media controls the world, and the West always says, we are the kindest and the most generous people in the world. By the way, that's absolute bullshit. Don't believe it, okay? Because I can tell you that one thing that is happening in the Western world is that the West is becoming less and less generous. Look at the United Kingdom, right? In an effort to help fight the war in Ukraine, what have they done? They have cut aid to Africa. So they are letting people in Africa to starve so that they can fight a war in Ukraine, right? So indeed, if you mentioned that the West likes to talk about sustainability, it's not true. They talk of sustainability, but their deeds don't match sustainability. If they really want to ensure that we have sustainability, you should press the pause button on the US-China contest, as I explained earlier, and you stop the war in Ukraine. So, paradoxically, even though President Trump wants to stop the war in Ukraine, the Europeans want to keep on fighting. If a war continues, you cannot fight for sustainability. The biggest damage to environment is always done by wars, right? So if the Europeans were really smart, they would stop the war in Ukraine and find ways and means of compromising. And they should talk to Russia. Here in Asia, everybody talks to each other. And why aren't the Europeans talking to Russia? That's the first rule of diplomacy. You must talk to your enemy, right? And that's something that has not been done by the Europeans. So when you mentioned also in our case about hunger, which is true, that's our priority. But fortunately, the largest poverty reduction programs in world history have been carried out in Asia. So as you know, China has rescued 800 million people from poverty. India has rescued a few 100 million from poverty. ASEAN has rescued a few 100 million from poverty. So in Asia, we are doing a good job of reducing poverty. And the best answer to cutting poverty down is not through aid, but through trade. And that's how Asian countries have done it. So we should promote more trade among the ASEAN countries.